Hello, everyone. My name is Moshe Naveh from the SAP Community team. Today, we are going to do a SAP Community Call about practical strategies for SAP Fiori adaptation in SAP S/4HANA with Jocelyn Dart, who's a user experience strategist and solution architect at SAP, and as well as SAP Technology Ambassador. So Jocelyn, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Marsha. Hi, everybody. So thanks for joining in, if you're joining in live or if you're looking at this afterwards. So close to Christmas. So this is sort of my last thing before the end of Sydney. And it's been some fairly strange and extreme weather today. It's nice to be talking to
Jocelyn, you're cutting off. Can you hear us?
Okay, what I wanted to do with this is I get a lot of questions about how to deploy Fiori in S/4HANA. And this is quite a wide-ranging topic because, of course, there are lots of customers coming from different perspectives. Some are greenfields and have never used SAP before. Some have been using SAP for a long time. Some have some users who have been using it for a long time and others who barely use it or maybe only go in occasionally. Some are doing more of a technical upgrade approach, and some in their conversion to S/4HANA are doing a full-on digital transformation to try and move into the intelligent enterprise. So there's quite a wide range. And one of the most important things is to understand that you can adjust how you roll out Fiori. So the intent of this session is to just explain why putting out at least some Fiori is important in S/4HANA, and to sort of compare and contrast some of the different approaches that we've seen customers do, and some of the pros, understand some of the pros and cons of those approaches. Now, I will say up front, and I'll remind you at the end, that you can mix and match those strategies. So you might, for instance, have and another, that's fine. But we'll go through those sorts of considerations. The other thing that I wanted to touch on with all of these approaches is the mindset, because what we're seeing across all of the projects, and we look at projects worldwide, because I'm part of the S/4HANA Regional Implementation Group, and we shepherd projects worldwide. We have responsibilities within our region. So I have responsibilities within the Asia Pacific Japan region. So I look after customers in Australia and Singapore, and then I have contact with customers in India and Japan and the Philippines and Korea. But we also work a lot with each other across the regional boundaries. So I work directly with some of the guys who are working in the Americas, and in Europe as well. So we get to see quite a lot of what's going on. And in our view, one of the issues that we see again and again is it's the consultants on projects themselves that can make or break your approach. Whether people are actually bringing their ECC mindset to an S/4HANA system, that's a big worry, because they're not really looking forward. And we've seen several times where the business was actually more innovation ready than the project team. And then you don't always get the optimal result. So let me start with why Fiori in S/4HANA. Oh, by the way, at the end of this, for any of you who are online, I'd be interested in your feedback or ideas as well. I think this is a topic we'll definitely be discussing over the next several months. I see this is one of those topics for the next year. Particularly as more customers are moving across to S/4HANA. So why do you want it? Okay, so the easy answer here is, and the way I always put this is, Fiori is the way business users consume S/4HANA innovations. So by this, what we mean is, look, the idea of providing intelligent enterprise innovations, starting with the user experience, starting with things, but also as we're going across these versions, 16.0.10, 15.11 and 16.10, you basically got the user experience. 17.09, we started to introduce chatbots with Copilot. 18.09, we brought in machine learning. 19.09, we brought in robotic process automation and the new Fiori 3 and Fiori situation handling. So these sorts of new intelligent enterprise approaches all are accessed via Fiori. We've also brought in a lot of new processes in S4HANA. So things like some of the cash management processes, group reporting in finance, central procurement, demand-driven MRP and predictive material and resource planning. A lot of these new processes also you will find are only available to you if you start using at least some of the Fiori. So what I say to people always on this S4HANA journey is, look to use some Fiori. How much in your first wave is entirely up to you, but get a foot on the rung, the bottom rung of the ladder at least, so you can start to bring new value and show why you're converting across to S4HANA. And that's all growing all the time. Now, if you haven't looked at the numbers of apps that we have available to us in S4HANA for a while, they do grow quite significantly with each SAP S4HANA release. And here, of course, obviously, I'm looking at the on-premise releases, which includes running S4HANA on your on-premise infrastructure, running it on SAP's HEC infrastructure, the single tenant edition, or running it on a hyperscale. All of those we consider as the on-premise or the full S4HANA solution. And right now we have over 1,700 Fiori apps available for SAP S4HANA, plus a lot of classic user interfaces. So that's your SAP GUI interfaces, your WebDimpro ABAP, and now with 1909, we also provide the web client user interfaces for CRM. And of course, you can run all sorts of URLs, such as to your cloud platform apps, to your other SAP solutions, such as SuccessFactors, Concur, as I said, SAP Analytics Cloud, etc. And of course, user assistance and Enable Now and other sorts of things. So there's a huge amount that you can actually do through the Fiori Launchpad. But when we come to the Fiori apps themselves, there's already quite a good body of apps. And we're seeing some roles now. I can point to over 20 roles where you have 30 or more Fiori apps. Some are almost at 60 apps. So then you're talking very, very good coverage of that role. Certainly when you look at some of the finance and procurement roles and some of the ones in maintenance, there's also some very good coverage there. So plenty to choose from. So when it comes to managing the pace of change, this is how I like to explain it to people. It's when you come from ERP or when you come from Suite on HANA, generally you've come from mostly doing things on GUI. Now, there are some customers who've done some Fiori, and that gives them, puts them a little bit of the head of the game in understanding where they're going to go to in terms of S4HANA, because obviously they've started to get their head around things like, how do I build apps? How do I deploy the Launchpad, etc. But a lot of customers there have not done any Fiori and they're still back on GUI. Now, what we saw in the early days, particularly on 15.11 and to a certain extent on 16.10, was we'd have a lot of technical conversions, by which we meant people would convert their S4HANA system, it'd be an IT-led conversion, and they continue using GUI. And for the most part, most roles could get away with that. And that wasn't ideal because, of course, then the obvious pushback is, well, what do we pay all this money for to go to a new system when we're not getting any business value? So what we recommend is do some Fiori, but what this diagram is intended to explain is it's entirely up to you how much Fiori you want to do. So you can start with just a little footprint, a showcase, essentially. It's a living showcase. So you're really using it in production, but something you can use to encourage others, or you can go for a much broader Fiori coverage, or you can say, okay, we're going to target certain intelligent enterprise capabilities to derive special value. And that's when you start to get into things like machine learning and robotic process automation and others. Now, this is where I'm going to give a little bit more detail. But I thought it would be quite helpful to have a little bit of an idea of impact versus business value. So this is sort of a little summary, and I'll explain in more detail. And of course, these are just indicative. So this is sort of a feel based on the feedback that we've got from customers who have tried different approaches. But you can see here, if you do SAP GUI only, you're really not going to get any new business value, or not very much, out of your S/4HANA system. I mean, some reports might run faster, but that impresses people for about 2 weeks and then everybody moves on. You can even find some things run slower, which is part of the magic of moving to the HANA columnar database. But there's not going to be much there that's going to impress your users if you're on SAP GUI only. And that's because all the new value is built into Fiori. On the other hand, there's still usually some org change impact because some processes change with part of conversion. So for instance, customers, vendors, employees go to the business partner model. You need to put in new asset management. You need to put in new GL, those sorts of things. When you come to Fiori Launchpad and just putting the Launchpad, but everything after there is a classic user interfaces, okay, you can get some value out of the features, but and you'll have some org change impact, but it's a little bit more than, particularly if you're moving people from SAP GUI to Launchpad. Now, obviously, this also is a little bit different if you've got users who've never used Fiori before and they've never used GUI before. You can sort of pick where you want to go. So a lot of these lower end strategies, they're good strategies that might work, say, if you are coming from an existing ECC user base who are very heavily invested in GUI for Windows, understand the power of GUI for Windows and are reluctant to give that up. This can be where most of your users sit. But what we'd like you to consider, at least try and put some in this showcase first category where you start to get some significant new value. And if you've got the capacity to do more, or if you're greenfield, so you're doing a new installation or a whole business process transformation anyway, definitely head for the big value. And I'll show you some of these scenarios as we're going on. So let's look at SAP GUI only. Okay, so if you're going to use SAP GUI only, you might get, for instance, the Belize theme applied automatically. But really, your GUI transactions are much the same as they were. So you do get some change. That's why we say there's some organizational change impact, but it's not very much, and you're not really getting any new value. So the way we view this is, okay, this approach, it's a technical conversion approach. Now, the pros of a technical conversion approach is you minimize disruption to users and you minimize disruption to IT. So where we tend to see this approach used successfully these days, in the early days, it was used because people just information do the Fiori part of it. We've fixed a lot of that and put a lot of heart. But these days, we tend to see this where there's a very, very tight time constraint on a project. For instance, they have a very short window to get things live before end of fiscal year. And then that's okay, provided they set a clear next stage for when are they going to add new value and when are they going to bring in Fiori. Okay, so the risk with this sort of thing, while you get minimal disruption, the risk is everybody's going to be very unimpressed. They're all going to be saying, what do you spend your money on? And I know this because the very, very first customer that I had, that I shepherded in the customer care program, that was exactly their response. We said, come on, you've got to do some Fiori, you've got to show some value. And they said, yeah, we're going to do it. No, and we don't have time anymore. And then they got to the end and they said, yeah, we've gone live. The IT team is patting themselves on the back. And they said, yeah, but our business are saying, well, where's the new value? And we're saying, well, we remember that conversation we had about Fiori. That's what this is about. There's another thing that a lot of people don't realize as well going in, is that Fiori is now used, particularly in the most recent releases, increasingly, to actually configure part of your system. And the rule here is when you configure things in GUI using, say, the IMG, GUI knows about GUI, but it's an older technology. It doesn't necessarily know about Fiori. But when you configure something in Fiori, Fiori knows about GUI. So it can configure Fiori and GUI. So things like adding custom fields, that's done in Fiori now. It's not done through the older techniques. So just be wary, because you may still need Fiori even in the development environment, even if you're going with this minimal approach. The one thing I'd say here is if you're following this approach, you need to communicate very clearly why you're not delivering new business value now and when you are going to deliver new business value. So it works if you do this for a very good reason, such as we've got a very tight time constraint, and then set an immediate next phase, and everybody's clear on that. Okay, so this is the next approach, which is having Fiori as the single entry point. And the first time I had a customer tell me they were doing this, I was kind of surprised, because it was like, well, why would you do the Launchpad as the entry point and then every app you've got on that Launchpad is actually just going back to GUI? And you're essentially moving for GUI for Windows to GUI for HTML. And that removes one pain point for everybody's PC. And okay, so that makes sense. There is another benefit of going in this approach. Even if you're not bringing people Fiori apps, you can bring them some Fiori features, such as the Fiori search. You can bring them notifications for workflows. You can bring them things like some settings and default values, even things like contact support. So if they have a problem, they can click on it, click on the contact support option and pass some accurate details across while they're looking at the problem. So there is some good value to be had in here, just with the Launchpad alone. And I've had in the last year, I have one of my public sector customers who use something almost essentially this as well, where they put out almost no Fiori apps. They had a very, very small set. And most of the Fiori apps they put out there were display apps, object pages, so that when people were using Fiori search, they could actually just see a nice screen with more detail about whatever invoice, order, whatever it was that they'd found. So there is some new value in this way, but of course, you're not going to get a huge amount just from the Fiori features. It is useful, but not a huge amount. You also have the benefit that you've sat down and worked out your architecture, you've established your entry point for future growth, and you've got rid of that need to distribute GUI for Windows. Now, I would say there's a caveat there as well, which is there are restrictions in GUI for HTML versus GUI for Windows. So GUI for Windows is a native desktop client, Windows-based. GUI for HTML is web browser-based. Web browsers work a little bit differently. Just like on your mobile devices when you run device features of your phone, it's sort of the same thing on GUI for HTML. So having now worked across a wide range of customers, I can tell you that even I've got a very large customer who's doing over 1,400 Fiori apps and GUIs and other things on the WebGen Pro app, etc., onto the Launchpad. We found maybe out of all of that, maybe 10 transactions where we actually needed GUI for Windows. So you may have a small number, but it's quite small. And the way they're managing it is only certain users now will get GUI for Windows. Just make sure, of course, that when you do this, if you're following this approach, that remember that your support team will need some skills to support Fiori. So again, you're getting them off the ground floor, but something to consider. Now, using SAP Business Client Launchpad connection as the entry point. This is kind of an interesting one that was very popular with some of our customers when we were on 1610 and 1709. Now, at that stage, we had some Fiori apps, but not a huge number. So most of them were in the situation of, okay, so most of our users, we want to give them the Launchpad, but we really, really want to give them GUI for Windows, for everything else. So they get a mix of the both worlds. Two different entry points for different types of users.
Jocelyn, sorry for interrupting. You were cut off. Can you please repeat the last two sentences?
Okay, sorry. Okay, so this was good where most of your users were used to GUI for Windows. You wanted to start moving them to the Launchpad, but you recognize that most of your users, you want to keep them in GUI for Windows. You just sort of want to shift their thinking a little bit. And we saw this locally at one of our larger utilities companies and at a consumer goods company used this quite successfully. What happens if you run the Launchpad through the business client? It looks almost exactly the same as running it through the browser. So it's the same Launchpad. You can configure it almost exactly the same. There's a little bit of extra single sign-on config, but that's about it. And when you run it this way, you don't have to set up anything differently in the Launchpad, but when you click on a tile that's going to a GUI transaction, it will launch in a new tab in GUI for Windows rather than GUI for HTML. So this is quite a good best of both worlds. I'm bringing them something, but still keeping them, giving them the old and familiar stuff. So it can be a useful approach. So again, some new value from Fiori Launchpad features, minimize disruption for your GUI for Windows future users. Again, you've got those benefits if you've got your foot on the bottom rung. And slight differences. So if people are running on browser or on business client, which also is a scenario we've seen, so they can run it on business client when they're on desktop, but maybe if they're on a tablet, they're running for GUI for HTML. Just make sure they're aware that there are some differences there. Okay, so the next one is the showcase approach. And this is sort of where we like people to start, is to have at least some business roles or some processes using at least some apps. And again, we've seen this successfully used at quite a few customers. I had one even who was just deciding to start with about 12 apps. I've had another one start with around 30 apps. And where they've literally said, look, we're just going to put out a very, very small set. And it might be something like an overview page or a dashboard, one of those manage and monitor apps. And maybe when you click on something, the next level down there might go to a classic user interfaces. So this is quite, and the reason you do that, navigate down to a classic user interface, is just so the same person doesn't have to swap over and log into GUI as well. So this can be quite useful. It gives you something to point out that says, look, here's the new value, start to understand the new value. It gets that fear of missing out starting to build. It's a nice option. And it lets you manage that change because you can carefully say, okay, who's most innovation ready in our business? Where's a good starting point? And take this approach. So one of the benefits of this approach is you're picking explicit new business value. So you're very clear again when you're communicating on what you're delivering up front. You also need to think about making sure you're clear on how you're going to motivate, use this showcase to motivate other parts of business. So you don't sort of want people to stumble over it. You want to say, okay, we're going to enable this team, and then we're going to go around and have a bit of a roadshow, or at least have a bit of discussion. As you know, you want a plan in place, not just hope people notice that somebody else has got something that they don't. Okay. Of course, your initial users and processors, you're going to have to focus and make sure they're happy, make sure things are tailored to what they need. So that's things like homepage design. And of course, your support team needs to be prepared. Okay, right, specific innovations first. So this is an approach we're starting to see a little more often now. And the tipping point has probably been the machine learning use cases coming in 1809 of S4HANA. So this is one where people are saying, I want some specific interesting things. And it can also be embedded analytics that are fully contained within S4HANA. There's some others that require maybe a cloud platform services side by side. But you can pick one of these and use these as a way to say, okay, we're bringing something new, something really flash, something of high value. And again, use that as a way to encourage other parts of the business to sort of move along a little bit. So this is one of the scenarios, which is the automated goods receipt, invoice receipt, reconciliation. So interesting one. So the advantage of course, then have high profile new value, because it sounds really sexy if you're going for something like machine. You may need additional skills. So be careful when you're looking at the machine learning scenarios available, or the robotic process automation, or any of those Fiori situations is the new one, that you double check if there's any additional requirements. Fiori situations, there's quite a few of those also that are fully contained, and most of those actually are fully contained in S4HANA, so they can be another good place. And of course, if you're going to if you're going for one of those with a cloud platform, then your support team will need to know those new technologies as well. But it can be a really good way to encourage support. All right, and the last major approach is SAP Fiori first. Now, this is interesting. Usually when we go down this route, one of the things we try to make sure is the project team itself is clear, because we've seen several customers where the project team thought SAP Fiori first meant SAP Fiori only, and therefore classic user interfaces were out of scope. That is wrong. Okay, that is not correct at all. SAP Fiori first means you're going to try to look at what Fiori apps are available. If you have a Fiori app available for what you want to do, you're going to do a fit gap and check if it fits your process. And if at all possible, you're going to try and use this new user experience rather than the old. Where it doesn't fit, where there isn't a Fiori app for your particular task, because 1,700 apps sounds like a lot, but believe me, over the whole gamut of what a business does, it's not full coverage yet. That's still where we're aiming for, not for every role at least. So it's use my Fiori apps as much as I can. Where I can't, then I know I've got classic user interfaces I call on. But I try at least go for the new one when I can. Now, the obvious places you go for, and the obvious customers who go for this are greenfields customers, because you don't have a SAP GUI history. So you may as well use the latest and greatest and get people used to the new one first. The other one is customers who are going for digital transformations, particularly in intelligent enterprise transformations. And they come in all shapes and sizes, and we've seen several of those. I'm involved in a huge one, which has got S4HANA and a number of cloud solutions, and that's those sorts of combinations are becoming more common. But when you're going for that sort of digital transformation and you've already basically set the expectation with your business that a lot of things are going to change, you may as well go for that big bang lump of one change, one big change, rather than drag it out. So this is a more proactive approach, but it does mean you maximize your value and you can bring those transformation. One thing, a couple of things to be careful. Even if you're going for this approach, you're almost Fiori except the Launchpad. So this is why I said it's possible to mix and match. You may find it's mixed and matched, this Fiori first approach with the Fiori Launchpad only and everything else, and there's a classic UI approach, simply because that's the way it works out for a particular business role. The other thing to be aware of is when you're going down this track, you need to plan your user experience and analytics work streams much more carefully, because it's going to be a much larger part of the project. We always recommend you have a user experience lead. It needs dedication, it needs focus, particularly in the early parts of the project. You need to set a strategy. You need to decide who you're impacting, how they're impacting, how that's going to get rolled out, how does that come together, what's the expectation to set with the functional and technical teams. But obviously, the more Fiori you're doing, the bigger the team is going to be. It's probably not going to be one person. It's probably going to be a team of person if you go down this track. You also need to think hard about user adoption activities. One of the blogs that I put out just recently is on homepage design. And this has been one of those areas that people forgot, particularly if they didn't budget for a user experience lead, right? Because you've got the technical team looking after the architecture, looking after your landscape, looking after your authorizations. You've got the functional team looking after the business processes. You need a UX person looking after the users, okay? And they work quite closely with your organizational change management team, but this is something that needs to start at the beginning. They need to be thinking, how is it going to come together for your user? Do you need to look hard at performance optimization, which you should do anyway. There's a lot you can do to tailor that performance optimization. But that's all part of your overall user experience. You've got to look at your shared Launchpad features as well. You really want people to be able to walk in on day one, say, oh, this looks pretty easy. Oh, that looks interesting. Let me click down on that. But basically be able to see what they need to do as soon as they walk in. You don't want to throw a mess of things out there and then have people spending 4 hours trying to figure out just to get things in a decent organization so they can start work. Okay. All right. So that's sort of the major approaches and some of the pros and cons. The choice really is yours. And of course, as I said, you can mix and match approaches. What we do find is the mindset of the project team is really the key determinant of success. So a couple of things that are good to make sure you're thinking about on your project. One is to understand that user experience is a critical work stream of your S/4HANA project. You need to have, as a minimum, a strategy. As soon as you start to put Fiori in place, and remember, even with a GUI-only approach, you might need Fiori in your development environment. You need someone who can turn it on. You need someone who can configure shared apps and features, such as My Inbox, features such as enterprise search and notifications. You need someone who can adjust that content to work for you. Your functional team, your analytics team need to be exploring what's out there, doing some fit gap analysis, and obviously a lot of apps you just turn on. Some apps have additional functional configuration. Some you might want to adjust them or extend them. And of course, there's always things where it's more complex and you need a developer involved. But UX itself is a work stream and that needs to be part of the project. Another thing that really helps to make the most of it is to think insight to action. One of the public sector customers I was at this year, we went in there and they'd done the right thing and said, we're going to put in a small showcase of apps. And then they said, but it's annoying for us because this person who only uses this small number of apps, they've got to log in to the Fiori Launchpad, and then to go and look at their transaction, they've got to log into SAP Logon. And we said, no, they don't. All you need to do is set up the configuration so that one app navigates to the next. So this is where we talk about insight to action. If you're interested in this, I've got a blog called Understanding Insight to Action. I've also demonstrated it in the recent open SAP course called Key Functional Topics in a system conversion to S4HANA. And that was week 1, unit 8. And I demonstrated how this works, and I demonstrated simple ways you can change apps. But really the configuration behind this, and I've got a blog on linked to the other on adjusting up tab navigation as well. The configuration behind these navigation points is pretty simple. What you're trying to aim for with something like this is I go into a Fiori app, which acts as my dashboard, my cockpit. And from there, then when I launch out, I go to a classical user interface that I'm used to. So that's perfectly fine. You can also, of course, go to another Fiori app, but understanding how that approach is supposed to work, understanding how business roles are supposed to work, that gives you a lot more flexibility in how you bring things to people, gives you a much more natural flow for how people go about their day. Another really important understanding is not to think of Fiori apps as a replacement of GUI transactions. Where I've definitely seen many teams come a cropper is where the functional team has assumed, oh, I can just work out my process as normal, and then I'll get to the end of my business process and I'll say, oh, I'm using transaction Migo, okay, and the Fiori app for that is, and just swap it in. That does not work. Simply does not work, right? Fiori apps are created from scratch. They're created to a different design paradigm, and they're created to focused on a specific task and role. So the first thing is you need to understand how that sort of role is envisioned, which is why we say do the rapid content activation in your sandpit, turn on and understand the role as a whole. And you also need to say, okay, that's how SAP envisions this role and task. Does that fit what we actually do? If not, can we adjust the app to what we need? Most apps can be extended, some can't, but most can. And it also means you need to think about, okay, there's a lot of Fiori apps there. They're actually not replacements of existing GUI transactions. They're brand new. And a lot of these apps actually are quite useful because they're more on this right-hand side where you're saying, okay, well, what we really need is a dashboard that pulls together a variety of things that used to be split out across different transactions. So this is where a lot of these manage and monitor apps happen. And every time we do that, we try and put some sort of innovations in there. It might be as simple as adjustable filters or something like that. But yeah, don't leave your choosing of the Fiori apps to the end. You need to be looking up front as you're deciding on your process, what's available to me, and consider the whole, not just assume you can just swap things in and out. Another point of misunderstanding, common misunderstanding, is thinking that SAP GUI transactions with Fiori Visual Theme or WebDimpro ABAP with Fiori Visual Theme are the same as Fiori apps. And no, they're not. The intention of the Fiori Visual Theme is to make it a lot easier to move around. And by the way, you can turn off the Fiori Visual Theme for classic user interfaces now. But the intention is to just make it easier so it feels more natural, same sorts of colors and fonts, doesn't feel like I've gone clunk into the old world. But it's not going to make a GUI transaction into a mobile-ready desktop application. Sorry, mobile-ready phone application, for instance. So usually It's okay to use these classic user interfaces on desktop. When it comes down to phone or tablet, it's a bit more problematic. I normally just explain this as, you know, these are technologies that were created before most devices existed. There's a limit to how far we can push them to cater for today's realities. We've done quite a bit, actually. WebDimpro ABAP, for instance, is now touch enabled. But still, it's a bit of a push. Getting these things down onto the smaller devices, I mean, you can force it, but it doesn't make for a good experience. So you do need to think about understanding where that fits. Remember that you need to think anyway when you're doing this user experience that mobile is not a free set of steak knives. I've seen some projects where you like literally walk in and at the kickoff of the project, everybody's saying, oh, we're doing everything and mobile devices. And it's like, yeah, so which tasks are going to fit doing on your desktop, which tasks are going to fit doing on your tablet, which tasks are going to fit doing on your phone? Because if you've got people walking around in safety gear and gloves or out on the road and they're driving a car, there's things you can do and there's things you shouldn't do when you're in those environments. So a little bit more to it than just assuming everything that's going to work everywhere. A really helpful one, and this is the scenario that I was explaining earlier, where all they wanted to do was do a very few apps and just not have to go and log in again on an SAP logon, is to think complementary. So think about Fiori as adding new value. Often it's the dashboard or the cockpit in to the rest of your day. That's bringing you some real-time insights. It's bringing you maybe some nice charts that give you a bit of a feel for the peaks and troughs in what you're seeing. So it helps you prioritize your work. But then when you go to act, you can still launch out to the old familiar GUI transaction that you used to. And this is quite a nice option and quite easy to configure. And you'll find a couple of my blogs explaining how to do this. So this also takes a lot of the pressure off, right? Again, you can say, okay, we're going to take this role. They're sort of ready for a little bit, but not too much. We'll give them a dashboard. But then from the dashboard, as soon as they click on anything, they're going back to something familiar, a way to bring across change. And it's good to actually do this. And we've seen some customers as well have used this approach and then said, okay, and nearly every month, we're going to add a few more Fiori transactions. And I've got one who started with a handful and they're now up to 200 Fiori apps. So it's really good technique to follow to say, okay, how do we sort of start to shift people across? You need to think about how you manage that shifting process, both from a business perspective and technically. But again, that mix of old and new gives you a lot of scope in how you manage the change. Couple last thoughts. This is my latest blog, and it's been something we've been talking about the people for a long time now. And this is really, again, this whole need for someone focused on user experience and thinking about how does this all come together for user. If you've got a homepage that looks like a bathroom, which is how one of our customers, Orica, actually described it at TechEd. You know, tiles everywhere. You're probably walking into a scenario where there's no one really looking after the user experience. You do need to think about that first impression. You don't want people to log in on day one and the first thing they go is, whoa, and let me run away because it's just filled with all sorts of rubbish. And I can see that the team who do this have no understanding of what I do, which is the usual complaint you then get from business users. So you want to at least put some thought into what they get on their homepage. If you've understood the insight to action approach, they only really need the entry points into their days. There's a lot of things you can do to sort of minimize how much stuff they get on their page as well. There's lots of ways they can find all the things they do occasionally, like search, like the app finder, like the a little bit of time saying, okay, are the names on the tiles sensible? Is it organized in a way that makes some sorts of sense to them? Very important for user adoption. One other thing, and this is usually where your IT team is quick to lock everything down to make their lives easy for the half dozen people in the IT support team, instead of thinking about the experience for the thousands of people they're supporting. Most people have a phone and a tablet and other sorts of devices at home. They're used to being able to personalize them to what they need. They expect a certain amount of personalization at work. Now, obviously, you're going to want to control that to a degree, but be prepared to give them some flexibility and work out how you're going to support it. The more flexibility you can give them, generally speaking, the easier your life should be, because then they can adjust things to their needs. But of course, there's a balance to be had there. And you might not want to turn on everything at once, but at least make them aware. Last couple of thoughts. As I said, most apps can be extended. We do have a lot of easy options for adapting apps, what they call the flexibility services, or you'd also see it as in-app extensibility. Those are really interesting because those are ways that within Fiori, you can actually adapt Fiori apps. And again, we come back to this concept of actually a lot of the configuration of Fiori is actually in Fiori. It's not back in your IMG. So that's something the project team has to come to grips with. And of course, if you're going down intelligent enterprise scenarios, they may need to get their head around some of these newer technologies. And the first three off the block are the chatbots, the machine learning, and the newest one is the robotic process automation. So they need to understand a little bit about that. So to leave you a few thoughts, the way I put this is, look, there's lots of ways you can handle your Fiori adoption. There's lots of ways to manage the pace of change. You need to think about what's the business value you're trying to achieve. What's your sponsor after? What are your business stakeholders after? What are you trying to encourage? Where are the opportunities for change? There's always some part of the business who's more innovation ready, either because there's a big opportunity or because they're in a lot of pain, more innovation ready than others. So look for those sorts of areas. Watch the mindsets in the project team. Make sure it's not your project team holding you back. Okay, there's plenty of even greenfields projects there where they're putting in a brand new installation, and yet the project team is bringing all their old-fashioned business suite thingy to the table. That knowledge is useful if you understand, if you use it as a launching pad for what you're going to do, but it's not if you use it as a way to say, oh, I'll just do it the way I did in my last project or my last 10 projects or the way I've been doing it for the last 10 years. You want people who are prepared to try new things. Look at ways to smooth the change journey for your business users, particularly homepage adoption, looking at how some of those central Launchpad features can help you, and mix and match strategies where you need it. So that's the thoughts that I had for today. If anybody's on the line and would like to share any thoughts from your side on what you've seen, or comments or feedback, I'd be happy to take that.
Thanks a lot, Jocelyn. So if you want to ask a question, you can do it either the Q&A tab or raise your hand, and I'll allow you to speak via the platform. We'll give people another minute. Great. So I think that is it for today. Thanks a lot, Jocelyn. And this recording will be available. Wait a second. We do have a question.
Okay, so we do have a couple of queries in the chat. Okay, So I'm going to point out that in the chat, I've actually put up the SAP Fiori for S4HANA tag in the community. So most of the blogs we put out are under that tag. There's also an S4HANA tag, but we like the specific one for Fiori. They're related. We normally put both tags on it. If you have questions, please ask them under that. And then we've got a question. When we develop new apps, which can be used in mobile also, what do you recommend? Okay, so I take it you mean which approach? Definitely Fiori, okay? One of the early mistakes we saw, even as early as 1511, was people would, again, this is project teams sort of bringing their old thinking to the table, and they'd say, oh, we need to develop something. Oh, I know, I'll go and create an app list variant. Oh, in GUI for HTML, I couldn't download. And you get all sorts of funny and strange restrictions, right, when you're using old technologies in new environments. So definitely, if you're going to build a new app, I would recommend go Fiori. If you've got an existing GUI transaction that mostly does what you need, then a good way to look at that to make it more Fiori-like is screen personas. But if it's something that you're building completely custom, I would go Fiori. And what we generally recommend there too, because it's easier and it's a quicker start, is to look at Fiori elements. You will find in S4HANA now, the balance is certainly tipped in favor of using Fiori elements because it gives you a consistent experience. It also upgrades. So when you upgrade your S4HANA version, your UI5 version, all of your apps get upgraded automatically as well, which is fantastic. So Fiori elements, overview pages, list reports, analytical list pages, object pages, these are all nice, easy things to do, quick to develop, good dashboardy cockpit things that work quite well. I mean, when I think back over my career as a consultant and doing SAP projects, a lot of the time when we were creating custom apps, it was often just to create a dashboard on top of other transactions. So for that, definitely Fiori elements. If it's a brand new thing and it's like a form or a specific process that you want people to follow, then you might be in freestyle Fiori app territory. So then you need that. That works quite well. I've seen some customers do that very, very well. Particularly when you look at, say, things like offline apps, all those sorts of advanced features when you may be bringing in some cloud platform mobile solutions. But of course, if you're going down freestyle apps, you need more skills. So you need to pick who's in your project a lot more carefully.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jocelyn. Do we have any other questions? Great. Okay, so thanks a lot, Jocelyn. The recording will be available in our SAP Community Calls page together with the presentation. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Okay, thanks, folks. And by all means, reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And you'll see I publish a lot of my blogs there, and look out for they almost always mention the Fiori for S4HANA wiki as well. And with that, happy holidays, everybody. Stay safe wherever you are, and I hope you have a wonderful break.
Thank you.